Language is something that we're surrounded by every day, whether we know it or not, and it's an important issue to be talking about because understanding language and its effects that it has on each individual uniquely is a lot deeper than we really understand. And I decided to delve into the language challenges of being a woman in sports media because this industry has a lot of gender inequality, and that has a lot to do with 90% of the workers in this industry being men. So when we talk about sports, we generally associate it with masculinity and men pretty much. And any woman that's a part of this is just not as capable as the men are because it's just such a masculine industry that we have made it out to be. Now, a lot of this has to do with the language that we use when talking about sports, as well as the people that are pushing these ideas to their audiences. And with sports media, these things are put on TV all the time and have a huge audience and a huge population of people that tune in and listen to these people and their opinions. And as humans, we are extremely influenced by the people we look up to, whether that's athletes in this situation or broadcasters or reporters. And when certain opinions are put out, a lot of people are influenced to think the same way and continue to push these same ideologies and ideas onto the people that they talk to every day. So language is something that gets tossed around, and it's not really fully understood the depth that it really has on society as a whole. So when we talk about sports and sports media, a lot of times when women are put down or seen as incapable when doing their jobs, such as sideline reporting or playing the sport in general, they're just not seen as capable as the men are. So I was interested in seeing how women could use language as a benefit to them instead of it being an obstacle. So doing my research, my initial question was to aim and understand how female sportscasters present themselves to audiences and discover how these perceptions affect their credibility and their trust and their respect in the media, because a lot of times women are not as respected or trusted as men in this industry. And my initial hypothesis was that women have to pay much more attention to what they say and how they say it because they're more apt to get scrutinized for what they say in this industry because they're just not as trusted and respected. And a lot of times they're not allowed to have their own opinions because people always just will have a problem with it. And women also have to prove themselves more in this field to get that credibility, and there's more attention and criticism put towards analyzing the comments and questions passed by women in this industry over the men, again because it's such a masculine industry. So in order to answer a lot of these questions that I was having on the effect of language and how women could use it to their advantage, I did my own research, and I looked at a lot of different studies on the same topic, but wasn't exactly finding what I was expecting to find. Initially, I wanted to come up with my own dictionary of sorts and come up with what women can do to prove their competence in this industry. And what I did find was that competence is something that doesn't come as we initially think it does. We think that credibility comes from your work and the things that you've done and your professionalism and your history. However, it has a lot to do with people's first initial perceptions of you. And competence as a component of source credibility is of interest here due to the historic gender bias and increased presence of women in sports media. And because there's been growth of women in this industry, there's been a lot of criticism and scrutiny put towards them because it's seen as such a masculine and male-driven industry. So an individual does not choose his or her level of credibility because the receiver of the message, whether they intend to do this or not, they make their own credibility judgments, determining your credibility. And because of the world that we live in with social media and such easy access to spread our own opinions, when these opinions are posted, it can have a huge detrimental effect to individuals, but also groups of people. So, for instance, Jessica Mendoza was recently put down in the media for her comments on sign stealing. And due to people's criticism and scrutiny towards her comments, it not only put her down and put down her credibility, but this also put down the credibility of women in this field in general. So it not only attacked Mendoza, but it attacked people's perception of women in sports media in general. So this will have a large effect on how people feel about future women and future females' comments on any issue regarding sports. So even these small instances have a longer and bigger effect for a larger majority of people. And the relationship between gender, competence, and credibility may be explained by gender schema theory. And according to this theory, individuals depend on schematic processing by using sex typing in order to quickly digest information. So gender schema pretty much proposes that the phenomenon of sex typing derives in part from gender-based schematic processing. And this is just a generalized readiness to process information on the basis of gender. And this happens a lot in sports media because when people nowadays just want information quick, a lot of times this gender schema theory comes into play because whether you know it or not, you're already analyzing the person's credibility and competence, and a lot of times it's based on gender. And this isn't necessarily the individual's fault or the audience's fault. It's just what society has buried into our minds. And it's important to note that these initial beliefs that we have in our heads aren't necessarily our own. So that's where we first have to start and understand how we can correct ourselves. And that's where language comes into play a lot, because if we continue passing around this idea that women are not as credible and are not as competent as men in this industry, then this first initial perception of women when they're doing their jobs in sports media are going to be negative. And this isn't something that we can control because it's our first instinct is to think, oh, they're not as competent, because this is what's put into our media and the language that we use regarding females in sports. So that's where the power of language starts. Having to distinguish between what society believes and what society continues pushing into our minds and what we generally believe ourselves. So no longer was I looking into what language women can use to their benefit, but I was looking into why gender inequality happens in this industry as a whole. And in the article Perceptions Concerning Obstacles, Stereotypes, and Discrimination Faced by Female Sports Reporters and Other Female Sports Professionals by Tess Here in the Athens Journal of Sports, the author delves deep into this topic and does a lot of research on her own about the topic of the perceptions of women in this field. And initially, she does her own review of other literature on both the representation of women in sports media as well as the amount of coverage they received. And as an example, she refers to the most popular women's sports team, which is the U.S. women's soccer team. And she mentions how they are highly skilled and have won numerous championships, yet they still don't receive the respect they deserve as compared to other major men's sports teams. And this leads to a salary gap between men and women in this industry, and she says it's impossible to fix unless they get more media coverage. Yet the media only covers what gets them the biggest income. So no longer is this a project on what women can do, because clearly women have proven themselves in sports media, because now it gets down to the language being passed on by sports media in both their coverage and also the dialogue that people have regarding this issue. And here also addresses how in order for women to succeed in sports, they must be considered more masculine, but also must maintain their feminine identities. And this is an issue in itself, because if we must seem more masculine to gain this credibility, then being too masculine will get us judged, and being too feminine will also get us judged. So having to rise to the standard puts an extreme amount of pressure on females, specifically to be perceived a certain way to the public, and not just only focus on their ability on the field, but also how people are receiving their skills and their perception. So because the industry is primarily dominated by men, it more often than not makes the discrimination and unequal treatment harder to overcome. So, in her research, here finds that women are much less preferred by the public in spectatorship, and attractiveness is of a much higher regard, and audiences believe that males are more knowledgeable in the field. So, she notes that one of the only ways to solve this inequality and discrimination is to raise awareness of the issue and make sure that women are no longer such a minority in the field, and to expand coverage of sports in general. And the U.S. women's soccer team also had a lot to say about this issue, and they mention how even the most decorated female athletes don't reach equal praise, coverage, or salary as compared to the men. And it does have to do with language, whether you see it or not on surface level, because language is not just what we talk about. It's also shown symbolically. And in this case, when women are getting paid less than men, it's delivering that message that they are not as capable and they're not as deserving. And that's language in itself. Even when spectator interest is up, like for the U.S. women's soccer team, for example, women still must compete for their spot. So no longer is this about proving themselves or gaining this credibility that I was originally researching about, but it's more so on the language being used in the media against women that are driving these perceptions of them. And this even brings us back to socialization of men and women at a young age and how language affects us at the very start of our existence. And the importance of masculinity to boys versus femininity to girls creates these obstacles and this form of credibility in certain fields. And the reason that masculinity and sports have become synonymous with one another is because boys are taught at such a young age through language. And not only are these opinions stated and created through commentary, but they are more abstractly shown through women's underrepresentation and sexualization. And this goes back to the statement that women have to be more masculine in this industry to get credibility and gain respect, but also keep their femininity in order to get the attention. And a lot of times we're over-sexualized. As just an observable example of the language associated with male sports versus female sports, I'm going to insert a screenshot first of what comes up with male sports in Google search. So what comes up is Olympic, popular, bulging, just things like strong and associating sports with masculinity. Things like professional come up, which proves their credibility right there, whether the person searching up images of male sports knows it or not, like we're digesting that information. And now I'll insert a screenshot of what comes up when you search up female sports. And as you can see, things like body comes up, which just proves the point of over-sexualization. And the first thing that people think of when they think of women in sports, it's more about their attractiveness and their physical attributes. And if you continue to look, things like gorgeous, beautiful, attractive come up. Even male comes up when you search up female sports. So no longer is it coming up with Olympic, bulging, professional, like in the male search, but now it has everything to do with attractiveness and physical attributes rather than knowledge or credibility in the field at all. Now, this is where language and dialogue and communicating with one another on this issue really comes into play, because change won't be seen until language is used to deliver the message that society doesn't always have to operate in this way and compare men and women, that they can both be knowledgeable about any field, and that no field is more masculine or feminine than the other. Now, I really hope this opens dialogue and communication about this topic, because without language and without talking about this issue, there's no change that's going to occur. So take what you want from this information, do some research yourself, and educate others on gender inequality in sports, but also gender inequality in general in our everyday lives. And use your language to promote a positive environment for both men and women in this industry. And hopefully that will grow into more equality being given to women in all aspects of our life, not just in sports.